Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley, President of Defend, Publish, and Lead, and welcome to episode 125, Writing the Literature Review section of an article. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides on this particular episode, but for those of you that are listening audio only, you can get the content from just the audio, I think. The slides are for you to go back if you want to see them. They will be linked in the show notes, and you can see references for that. So for this particular podcast, this one came about because we're going to be running a literature review writing class in June of 2023. So if anybody's interested in joining us for that class, I'll have information at the end of the episode. But why I'm interested in that is that so many people come to us to get help with literature reviews because they are a difficult genre and they play out in different ways. We sometimes think about a literature review as part of a dissertation, like the literature review chapter is one of those famed examples. But more often, people will come to us when they're writing scholarly articles and say, I just don't really know how many sources to cover in this literature review. I only really have 3 paragraphs to knock out a literature review in this particular scholarly journal. In other journals, literature reviews take up more than half of the article, so it gets a little bit confusing there. And honestly, it does vary journal to journal. There is not a set way to do a literature review section in an article because it is so dependent on the specific publication that you're going for. But I did do some research on this because I've been thinking about it a little bit more for one of my projects, and I tried to think about how writing a literature review in an article is it can be a way to execute some of your writing skill in maybe a place that we think of as kind of a throwaway section in an article, or maybe it's an easy section because you're just recapping the other sources before you get to your own content. And when I started thinking about that, I came up with 2 principles that I think clarify a lot of different ways to think through the literature review. And this is compiled from a lot of things that I found written about literature reviews that I wanted to share with you today. So one of the things that I think is important to remember when we're thinking about a literature review in the context of a journal article, so we're just talking about that little bitty section, or possibly it's a large section, depending on the journal, but wherever the spot is where you're providing that background information, the previous research that has been conducted, whatever that section is called, because sometimes it's not even called a literature review, sometimes it's called background. But that goal here is really to locate your own research within the context of existing literature. So keeping that in mind, I think, is a good way to kind of decide what is in your literature review in the article and what is out. So one of the things that we find with graduate students writing dissertations, and they're writing the literature review chapter, I would say probably half of the projects that we look at, the literature review chapter is the longest. And, sometimes we'll talk with the students about this, and sometimes that's just the way some of these PhD programs or EDD programs want. They really want a very comprehensive literature review that shows mastery of the knowledge in the program or something like that. But to me, it's telling if all these other sources are taking up way more space in your project than your own voice and what you're working on or what your research is doing. And so for me, I've really started thinking through this idea of how does my project fit with other literature, but then also within the context of the specific project that I'm working on. So we're going to look at that in a minute a little bit more specifically, but how this plays out, how we might locate our own research within the context of existing literature could happen in 2 ways, and usually does happen in 2 ways, regardless of the publication. One would be, of course, there's some kind of a summarization of relevant literature to the project. So it could be if you're using, someone else's theory, maybe you're going to spend some time talking through that. If you're talking about 5 other studies that also looked at nutritional links between vitamins and growth or something like that, of course, you're going to have those in there. But you're going to summarize what's been done prior to your study. And this is where I think it gets dicey and where people's literature review sections go too long, because how do we know, if we're going to talk about the history of all the things that have come before, we all know that we're never going to read all the articles on our topics anymore. So there's hundreds, there's thousands of articles out there, probably millions on many topics that we haven't read. So it does get daunting when you try to figure out how to, figure out where your research is in the context of these other ones. And so I want to emphasize here the idea of summarizing relevant literature and what's relevant to your project. So we'll talk through that one in a second. But the second one, and this is a phrase that I really liked. I came across this in one of the lib guides for USC. I put the link on the screen, but I'll also throw it in the show notes. Is this idea that in the literature review section, you're doing a little bit of a reshuffling of the relevant literature in a way that informs your current study. And I love the way of thinking about this because when you're writing a literature review, I think sometimes our fallback tendency might be to go either by chronology. So we're just kind of going, this study came first, this study came second, this study came third. And chronology is not the best organizing mechanism for many scholarly projects. Or another way that it sometimes happened is very haphazard. So it could be where you just pick maybe a couple of points you want to make and talk about a couple of sources with each of the points. I've got some really good suggestions that have come from these lib guides that I want to share about how to do this reshuffling, because it offers some ways to think about organizing that section in a more systematic way to help you decide what's in and what's out. So for those of you who are just listening in audio only, what we're talking about here is if we're thinking about what your literature review is supposed to do, it's supposed to locate your own research within the context of existing literature. It's supposed to summarize relevant literature to date and then reshuffle that relevant literature in some kind of a way that informs the current study. So that summarizing and that reshuffling could be taking place at the same time. So if you move sources around in an order that makes sense for your project, you can summarize them as you get to them. So talking about this a little bit more specifically then in this podcast, I'm really going to focus on just those two parts for the remainder of this episode. But one of the things to think about for this first part is how to summarize the literature to date. This is where, again, it may be tough to decide what sources are in and what's out because so much literature has come before you. But one of the things to think about then is what is your focused and specific argument, or what is your focused and specific project doing? And every time you decide that you're thinking about using a source in a literature review, take a very hard look and decide, what does this source provide that makes people understand my study or my project? So let me say that again. What does this source provide that makes people understand my project or my argument a little better? So for me, that was very helpful because I just finished working on an article where I had to make the call on a source that I think gave some interesting historical context, but it really didn't have any bearing on my focused and specific project at the moment. And so I decided to cut it and I put something in that was more relevant, and I'm glad I did. So just the fact that the study came before your study doesn't make it an automatic in that it's related to your focused and specific project or argument. So, that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is to look at whatever your target journal article or your target journal is, look at some of the articles in there and just look at the literature review sections and just count how many sources they're citing in there. That was very helpful for me because I was writing for a new journal. And in my mind, I thought, well, a literature review maybe has like 20 sources in it in a 25-page article. I was kind of just in my mind, I don't know where I got those numbers. That's just what I was thinking. Well, I have to say, I was surprised to see that in this particular journal, most of the articles had between 12 and 15 citations within the literature review. That's it. So then I started thinking, well, I really don't want more than 15 because every article I'm looking at doesn't have more than 15. And so for me, that was really helpful to try to decide, all right, does this source really, really give some background on understanding my specific project or argument? And I have to say it was a little bit easier to decide what to get rid of. I still, there was one more source that I wanted to use, and I actually ended up with 16 sources because I could not make that final call, which I think will work out okay. I think it'll be fine. But for me, that was really helpful. Another thing that helped for me is to think about, if I have to know how these sources in this literature review all individually contribute to understanding to the research problem in some way, that also helped me to eliminate duplicates. So I think it's okay to say, let's say like Smith 2006 did this study first, but then here's 3 other people that did the study. Maybe you have a parenthetical to say this research was replicated in Adams and Wu and, Jones and whoever. You could do that if you want to. I think that's fine. But thinking about space and word counts and things like that in our journal articles and our literature reviews, if we just focus on how it contributes to research understanding, I think that can be really helpful. So here's a couple other ways to think about linking relevance to your specific project. So is a source relevant or not? One of the things to think about too is how the sources relate to each other. Sometimes you need to talk about a conversation happening in literature. So that will help you determine what's in and what's out with a specific conversation. So you want to think about if your sources confirm or they contradict or extend each other's research. Along that, we also know all literature reviews point to a gap in a research. We might not call it a gap per se, but all literature reviews essentially are showing where the hole is that your specific project comes in. So part of that literature review will be recognizing where certain studies didn't go far enough or where the literature left off, and that's where yours comes in. Another way to think about these sources when you're trying to figure out why you have the sources in there or what they're doing is to think about, are they providing a history of a problem? Are they there to define a theory or a term? Do they maybe show a partial solution, but it didn't use enough participants in that study, and now your study has more participants? Think through where all those pieces are. And so one episode I want to recommend that you look back at is episode 62 in this podcast. It's called Reasons for Source Support. And it basically talks about 4 reasons you might be using a source in your essay. So we might think in this case, when we're thinking about a literature review section for an article, well, my reasons for source support is because this is part of the literature review, but that's not really a clear answer. A clear answer would be, is this source providing a definition? Is this source an object for analysis? And if that's the case, if it's an object for analysis, it wouldn't be in the literature review anyway. Like, so those of us that are, say, working with literature or anthropology or classics, if we're working with a text, we're not going to, we're certainly not going to use that source as a piece of the literature review. It will be an object for analysis. So if you check out that episode 62, I say a little bit more about that, but I think that's also helpful just in general to decide what are sources doing in this scholarly article. Are they here for background? Are they here to provide an explanation of the methodology? Are they giving a justification for my methodology? Are they showing a call to action that now my article is responding to? If you know that about all the sources in your article, I think that would help a lot to figure out what can be in that literature review. Because it's true, not all the sources you use in an article will be in the literature review, but for the ones that are, they need a reason to be in that section specifically. So that was part 1. So summarizing the literature today. And then part 2, and this is the part that I'm excited about because I always love, writing organization and project management. But this LibGuides that I mentioned, again, I'll link it in the show notes, talked a lot about how to structure that literature review section. And this is a spot that we do a lot of coaching on individually at Defend, Publish, and Lead. So if anybody's having trouble writing this section or getting it to be very concise, certainly you can come back to us. But one of the things I really liked about this LibGuide is it talked about determining what your organizing principle is. And at least from what I've seen with the text that we're working with from clients, they tend to either go by chronology or they go by maybe a topic or a theme. But I liked all these other options. And so I'm going to either on screen for those of you on YouTube, but for those of you listening audio only, I'll just run through them real quick. So one of the principles you could do is a new interpretation of past research. So maybe you're looking at something that, maybe past research had kind of a school of thought on and it had been accepted for a very long time, but now you're putting a new interpretation over that to explain why your project or your study is here. You could do a scenario in a lit review where you're showing the contrasting schools of thought about your topic. So I just saw somebody do this. We had one of our clients that was working in history and talked through a couple of different ways that certain historical events are approached and talked through these schools of thought. And it was done very, very well. Other things that I think could work, chronology is still a viable option, but I think if you're going to do it, you want a very deliberate tracing of history versus just that this source was in 1958 and this one is 1971 and this one's 1993. Having some kind of a trace where it's tracing a history of intellectual progressions within a field, or maybe you're tracing a specific debate or maybe a couple of debates, that could be an organizing principle. You could also trace the development of a term or a specific theory and how it's developed in relation to your project. You could do organization based on major authors who have written, or maybe major researchers who maybe are the very forefront of, say, sickle cell disease, or they're maybe the forefront in travel tourism. You could use something like that, or major theories to organize, where you're exploring, say, 3 major theories that are relevant to your particular topic. We certainly can use literature review to establish that a problem exists. Sometimes this actually goes more in an introductory scenario where you're providing just a real brief hit on why something is a problem. For example, I know I did this in an article that I wrote where I was talking about how we teach undergraduate students how to write with more time spent on them than we spend on faculty members teaching them how to write. So I was able to throw a nice quick statistic out in the introduction. So in that case, that didn't go in that particular article, but I could definitely talk about it more if I really wanted to establish that there's this problem exists and why it exists. I think that could be good. But another thing that you can do in that literature review, of course, is just establishing that there's some gaps there. While we have a whole discussion of A, we don't have a discussion of B. And so all of those can be structuring mechanisms for literature reviews. You're not going to do all of these in one literature review section in an article. You might be able to pull off 2 of them, possibly 3, but maybe just 1 is all you need to do to set it up in a nice, concise way. And what you're doing there is providing that background for somebody that might need to go back and take a look and see what research is done before your topic, or to understand where your project fits in that whole conversation within your discipline. So I really like these other ways of thinking about structure that might help you organize it a little bit better. Another thing just to throw out there, I mentioned at the beginning that we are doing a quick writing class again. We do run our monthly writing classes at Defend, Publish, and Lead. They're fairly low cost, and we tend to dive in on a topic. So our June topic is writing a literature review, and it will focus on many of these strengths. So how do we do this nuts and bolts of writing a literature review? What are some strategies when we encounter one again in the next project, So as with all of our classes, the idea is that you learn the skills so you can do them on your own, but you do have the benefit of a writing coach teaching you how to do that, and we can hope that you can join us for that one. So hopefully this is helpful for you to think about writing. I also want to point out the Textbook and Academic Authors Association, which is one of our podcast sponsors, also has some help on the other side of this. So I know we talked about a literature review in this particular episode, but they have resources if we think about it from the other side when you're actually doing the reviewing. And I recently just had to complete a book review. So I went to TAA to see if they actually had a resource for doing a book review or some ideas about how to kind of frame that feedback. And when I went in there, if you go to the resources for academic writers, under the templates and samples section, there is a checklist, and it's a really cool one. It's very simple to use. In fact, I'm going to use it with some students because I took a look at this and I'm like, graduate students totally need this. But there is a great checklist in there for a book review evaluation. So if you're checking it out on YouTube with me right now, you can see what it looks like. But if not, and you belong to TAA, go in there and check it out. It's one of the very first items in the templates and samples section if you just click the book review evaluation checklist. So hopefully this information helped in this particular episode, and happy writing this week.